Okay, let's come together just for a moment in some thoughtful reflection. Okay, let's pray together. Gracious God, as we breathe in the air you provide, cause us to see the image of breathing in your presence. Guide what we do in these moments. Be present with us. In Christ's name, amen. Allow me to just give you a heads up. Last week, remember, we had some problems with the images fitting the screen. So this week I tried to figure out what the screen projection ratio is. And we apparently don't have any manuals that show us that or any information. So we don't know what that is. So I tried to readjust and set it from 1610 and 0.2, which is what I had it before for the other presentations, to 16.9, and you can see we're losing the screen. So that made it 2 box, and we're going to lose part of it. If it gets to be too annoying or too difficult, what we may do is just stop today, and I'll reconfigure. Richard and I are going to work together to see if we can figure out what's going on and reconfigure to the same configuration we had the first 4 weeks where we didn't have any problems. And I may just have to add a week to the presentation and do the rest of this presentation next week. Okay, we'll see how it goes, but we're going to lose a lot of information because I have some pretty full slides and they're busy in this presentation. So we'll just have to see how that works out. Okay, so we're back to, and it is asleep. We have that problem too. Again, we are talking about the influences, the flow of things that into the shaping of the Bible and the formation of the Bible. We're getting a little closer. We've been in a global look for the last several weeks, and we've also been looking at materials, and we've been looking at manuscripts and codices and things like that. Now we're going to get into the biblical history period of time for the most part. But again, remember, this is the community, this is the world that gives us the Bible. It is shaped heavily by the Sumerian culture, our civilization from about 6000 BCE. The Akkadians, the Gutians were just like a hiccup in time, and so there's not a lot of information there at all. The Dynasty, from which, remember, Abraham came from so this is around his hometown. Ancient Assyrian, we're talking about the first Assyrian Empire, okay? So this is not the Assyrian Empire that we read about that during the time of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so forth, the prophets. That would be the Neo-Assyrian. We have the first Babylonian period that precedes, again, Abraham, or at least most think precedes. Some think, and I'll get to a biblical timeline here in a moment, that those dates may be adjusted for the Bible. Then there are a host of others that we will encounter as we read through the Bible story, and certainly archaeology and history help document the Canaanites, the Philistines, the Phoenicians, for example. We got part of the alphabet. One of the first alphabets were from the Phoenicians. So we have all of these folks who live in and around the people called Israel, or the Hebrew people, from which we get the Bible. Okay, some biblical guidelines. Oh, and Richard, can you kind of cut the lights? That may help because I'm having problems back here. I know they may be. There, that's a little better. Thank you. This is a traditional biblical timeline, but there are those scholars who believe that this timeline is a little bit out of whack at the beginning, and that Abraham probably dates to about 2200 BCE, and that the time of Joseph would be somewhere around 1900, the latter part of the 19th century BCE. that the Exodus and the conquest obviously happened a little earlier than they're projected here. But this is still pretty much the standard or the traditional time frame that most scholars would go with. Just know that there is room for discussion. We just don't, and I'll talk about why in a little bit, mainly because we don't have any archaeological or extra biblical evidence to help us with this. For example, you would think if the people of Israel had been slaves in Israel for 400 years, there'd be some record of that in the Egyptian archives, and there isn't, at least to date. There isn't any evidence of the Exodus. There isn't any, so it's hard to know what the dates are until we really get down to about the United Kingdom, and that's where we're going to start today. And we'll quickly move on into the Babylonian exile. This is the pivotal event. The Assyrian crisis and the Babylonian crisis that leads to the exile are the pivotal events leading to the development and the collaboration and the collecting, collating of the materials that become the Bible. So we start with the United Kingdom. We're moving from a period of theocracy into a federation. We're a federation of states, so just think of it like that. Israel becomes a federation of tribes. Of the 12, you've got 12 tribes, even though the Levites aren't a tribe, but Joseph's share has been divided among the two sons. Okay, so that's how you get to the 12 tribes. Saul becomes the first king because here's where that external influence begins to play a part. The people of Israel say, we want to be like other people. We want to have our king too. And so, much to the chagrin of the religious leadership and the advice of the religious leadership, eventually they give in and Samuel anoints Saul as the first king. And most of you know a little bit of his story. He essentially becomes a manic depressive and is obsessed with killing David because David has become so popular. He's killed his tens of thousands, and Saul has only killed his thousands. And beyond that, who knows what went on, but you and I would probably call it manic depression. And so acting out in moments of explosive anger, in his mania, he begins to try to kill David. And unfortunately, David has a friend in Saul's son. Okay, then shortly after Saul kills himself because he is losing a battle to the Philistines, he falls on his own sword, as you remember from the Bible story. Then he has a son that becomes the king for about 2 years, but there isn't a whole lot to say about him. Then it's David, because David has already been anointed by Samuel to be the king of Judah. Okay, just the tribe of Judah. And eventually he will become king of all 12 tribes. And during this period of time, there's a certain amount of prosperity. There's some expansion to the kingdom. And you know David's story pretty well, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time there today. And it looks like we're going to get away with slides. I hope so. Solomon, David's son, is the next in line after David. David begins to get pretty sick, and so Solomon is announced as this. He's the 10th son born to David, and the second by Bathsheba. And most of you know the story of how he taxed the people very, very heavily. And he built wonderful palaces, and he built this beautiful temple. David wanted to do that, but Solomon got to do it. So he built this beautiful temple. A lot of opulence apparently around him. And most of you know his personal life and the number of concubines and porcupines and all of those folks that he had in his harem. So some key developments in the reign of Solomon. Very early on in his reign, he expelled Abiathar. I'm going to introduce you to two words you're probably not familiar with: Mushite and Aaronite, or Aaronide, okay? There are several schools of priests. There are Levites, there are the descendants of Moses, the Mushites, there are descendants of Aaron, the Aaronites. The Aaronites were the ones who did most of the sacramental stuff. The Mushites were the one who kind of did the care of the temple and the facilities and those kinds of things. Generally speaking, this is what most scholarship believes today. But there were several schools in the Levites as well. But these two are the important two, the Mushites and the Aaronites. So when Solomon becomes the king, he expels the Mushite priest Abiathar, and Ahijah anoints Jeroboam as a king within the northern kingdoms, and we'll get back to that in a moment. So Solomon makes Zadok, an Aaronide priest, the high priest. And so there aren't two different groups. There aren't any Levites necessarily, other than they all are Levites. Moses and Aaron are Levites, so they're all Levites, but there aren't the schools of the Levitical priests. It is an Aaronide school, okay? This becomes very important to the production of the Bible, as you will see a little later, okay? Then Rehoboam succeeds Solomon as the king. Well, there's good news and there's bad news. Jeroboam, who has become a leader within the tribe of Ephraim, he comes from one of Joseph's sons' tribes. He comes to Rehoboam and said, "We have been taxed to death. We want Republicans in the House, not Democrats. And so we have been overburdened with your taxes. Okay? We need this to stop. What are you going to do as you become king?" So Rehoboam calls together a little coalition of his advisors, and his advisors say, "You've got to keep the foot on the pedal. You've got to keep the hammer down. You've got to keep taxing the people so we can have these wonderful things." This caused a schism. So Rehoboam remains the king in the south, while Ahijah, who is a Levitical priest in the city of Shiloh, and I'm going to show you a map in a little bit, and I'll show you where Shiloh is located. He is Jeroboam, and the 10 tribes associated with the north essentially secede from the union. It's no longer a federation. We now have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Rehoboam continues the Aaronide legacy. Okay, Jeroboam becomes then the king of the northern kingdom. He moves things around a little bit. And he makes things even worse, because he establishes his capital at first at Shechem. It will eventually end up at Samaria, but at first it's at Shechem. And he develops 2 religious centers, because the main religious center for Judah is still in Jerusalem. Jeroboam establishes religious centers at 2 places called Bethel and Dan. Remember Tel Dan that we looked at, a couple of the archaeological discoveries, the one that talks about the house of David or the house of an uncle, depending on the translation of the word. And I'll show you again the temple site at Dan in just a moment. So there are 2. But he also, instead of cherubim on either side of the Ark of the Covenant, where God's seat is essentially, there are 2 calves. There are golden calves. This all begins to play into the development of 2 different, the J and E documents that we're going to talk about a little later in the presentation. The Mushites and the Aaronides. The Aaronite people are quite proud. But it is Aaron who remember, in the wilderness wanderings, who helped build the golden calf. So these two can make a connection. The Mushites, whose hero is Moses, are going to accuse the Aaronites of calf worship. Okay, so it gets built into the script, to the Bible as we had inherited. He appointed non-Levitical priests, neither Mushites nor Levites nor Aaronites. He creates a whole new school to serve in the leadership at these places. The Mushite priests who have been sent by Solomon, to Shiloh, have retreated essentially to Shiloh. They're just excluded from everything. Aaronites are still in service in Jerusalem, but now the Mushite priests are completely excluded. This begins to create tension. Okay? Think of how churches operate. Think of how some people get connected with one pastor, and when one pastor leaves, then another pastor comes, and there's still this people over here in this camp, and there's, you know how, it's natural. Okay, so what we're going to see, part of the Bible is produced by this natural tension between these two people. Okay, so here, again, I have to turn around from the mic, and I know that's not going to pick up in the recording, and I know you may have some difficulty seeing, but let me turn around. So now this is Shechem, and this is Shiloh right below it. Okay, so this is the capital, and this is where the Mushite priests are. Bethel is down here. Dan is up here in the north. Okay, so now we've got the divided kingdom, and mostly it is Judah and part of Benjamin that form the southern kingdom. But did you see Simeon? What happens to Simeon? Simeon's not in the north, but they're not on the side of Judah. Some of them may have been assimilated into the tribe of Judah, and the others must have migrated because Simeon kind of goes away in this schism. Okay? All right. And this is the temple site at Dan. This is the foundation that has been recovered in archaeological digs. Now, what followed politically is important. What followed, according to the Bible, is a host of ineffective, I'll use that word, but the Bible calls them bad kings as opposed to good kings. Bad because they usually are not very righteous. They practice polytheism. They may intermarry with other groups and bring in their gods and idols and so forth. So it's a series of, quote, bad kings in the north, all the way through to Hoshea, which is when he's the last king in the north and the Assyrian Empire has taken over. Assyria became this all-consuming empire. It grew. All of the area that we looked at a moment ago called ancient Mesopotamia pretty much controlled that whole area. With its capital at Shechem, later it was moved to Tirzah and to Samaria, as I said a moment ago. Israel was naturally absorbed into that empire. It attempted an alliance with against the Assyrians, with the Egyptians, and that backfired. That's what led to its demise. And eventually the capital, Shechem, fell to the Assyrian forces in 722 BC, and by 720 BCE, essentially the northern kingdom ceases to exist. It has been absorbed into, and as you know from your history, what happens is when these empires take over, in order to weaken the people they have just conquered, they take the leadership and disperse them throughout the rest of their empire. And they bring others that they've conquered into this location. These folks eventually will intermarry, and they will become the Samaritans in the New Testament. So it isn't that the whole northern kingdom was eradicated or killed. They were simply absorbed and dispersed and they never more stood as independent tribes, nor as the kingdom of Israel after this. Now, these events played a key role in what I'm going to refer to in a little bit as two separate documents, J and E. And I'll explain that in a moment. So now Assyria, with its capital in Nineveh, and the only thing that's standing independently is Judah. Judah's still there. They're going to be required to pay tribute, and they're going to align from time to time with Egypt, and that causes problems. But essentially, Judah continues to retain its independence. And again, part of the tribe of Benjamin, probably, if not all of the tribe of Benjamin. Those two tribes together, known as Judah. In the political developments, again, just to make a review, Rehoboam is the one who succeeds Solomon, and he is the king in the south. Jeroboam has become the king in the north, but now that kingdom is gone. We'll get to that in a moment. Abijah succeeds Rehoboam. Asa was next, and I'm not spending a lot of time with these. I'm just simply going through the lineage here just a minute. See, some of them are zealous for God, some of them are bent to idols. This one rid them. Jehoshaphat is important because he has the Levitical priests. He's got the Aaronite priests who are essentially in charge of the temple. And again, it's at Jerusalem. That's the center of worship. But he has the Levitical priests dispersed throughout the countryside to become not just priests, but essentially to function as judges or leaders in the area, like the judges of old. Okay, they're not judges in the sense of just making legal decisions, but that's clearly part of what Jehoshaphat wants them to do. He wants them to make decisions that are influenced around civil law and religious law. And when we talk about religious law, we're probably talking the Torah, but this may predate the Torah. This may be some of the forerunners. This may be elements of what has been inherited. Remember, we talked about the laws of Ununi. We talked about 2 or 3 other types of laws that existed, some of them almost identical to laws we find in the Bible. So these laws have been assimilated from the nations around them and influenced. So it may not be the 613 laws that we normally think of in the Torah yet, but probably some of the preceders to that. Ahaz, yeah, you know, that's a name that's pretty familiar to most people who read the Bible. Yeah, he was a problem. Sacrificed his own son. Hezekiah was a bright spot. There are two. Hezekiah and Josiah are two very bright spots in the kingdom, in the southern kingdom. Hezekiah was a sincere individual, very righteous, very faithful man, believed solidly in God. And in expecting an attack from the Assyrians, he was also a pretty astute leader. He realized that quickly Jerusalem with its walls could be very isolated, and they wouldn't have a source of fresh water. So he built a tunnel that is still there today from the Gihon Spring. You can actually, those of you who have been to Israel, maybe Paul, you did that when you and Shannon were there, you can actually walk through the waters of the tunnel. You have to bend over in some places, and it's a pretty lengthy tunnel from the Gihon Natural Spring outside on the southeastern side of Jerusalem. And he brought the water into a reservoir at that time. In the New Testament, it becomes the Pool of Siloam. So pretty significant thing that he did. influenced righteousness, faith in God, and then militarily did this wonderful thing so that they had a fresh source of water, even if the city came under siege for long periods of time. Manasseh, just not quite the same. You got a different story. It's like hiccups, up and down. So it doesn't always stay very good. Josiah, one of Judah's very best kings in the southern kingdom. He ordered the high priest, Hezekiah, to use some of the tax monies. Now remember, Solomon had taxed the people. Rehoboam opted to keep the taxation in place. So the people were continuing to pay money into the coffers. And so Josiah decided to do something constructive with that money and have Hezekiah go in and renovate the temple. Apparently, during the time of Amon and others, it was not necessarily used to its best. And so it had been neglected. But in the course, he apparently finds a book. And some people believe that's going to be the source that I'm going to talk about a little later, if time allows. I may not get through this class today. This is a little lengthier time. But a great king with a spiritual focus. This is the time of the Babylonian invasion. 696, 697, that's the time of that first invasion. And during this invasion, the leaders are dispersed in an attempt to weaken Judah and stop any of their kind of independence and resistance to paying tribute to the Babylonians. Because the Babylonians have become the world power. Jehoiakim is taken captive by the Babylonians in that period of time. He's one of the leaders. Zedekiah is put in place by the Babylonians, but he switched loyalties to Egypt, and that was the ultimate no-no. And so now Judah is no longer an independent nation. Judah is absorbed into the Babylonian Empire, but they have been relocated almost as a group. We'll see here in just a moment, to the river Kibar. You remember reading Ezekiel? And the Spirit lifted me up and led me to the people along the river Kibar. Excuse me. And I sat among them, amazed, stunned, for 7 days. He couldn't even function because the people were so depressed, so dejected, so dispirited when he got to them along the river Kibar. And this goes on for now almost 50 years altogether. So some transitional thoughts for us as we approach these documents that I've been referencing. We've already seen how the various cultures influence and shape the laws, the civilization, the way people live, the way people relate to each other. Their religious beliefs continue to influence various leaders in the Hebrew people, in the people of Israel. Okay, so we've been looking at that since we started this series. And again, archaeological evidence is very, very limited until we get to the Neo-Assyrian period empire around 900 BCE. Nothing is yet from Egypt, not one reference. Well, you can understand why the Egyptians might not talk about the Exodus, but you would think they'd be proud of having them as slaves. And there's no reference. in any of the Egyptian archives or documents that we found to date. There's no reference to the Exodus. Of the 31 supposedly conquered cities, when we get to the book of Joshua and start the conquest, of those 31, there's only evidence on 5 of those cities that really coincides with the timeline most scholars think the biblical timeline falls into. So there isn't a lot of archaeological evidence there. Even in Ai and Jericho, there's evidence of destruction, but it was long before the conquest. So, okay, that leaves us with a few questions. With so little extra biblical or outside of the Bible, archaeological evidence that supports the First Testament's accounts, at least through the Assyrian Empire, the creation, the flood, the Tower of Babel, the migrations of Abraham and Sarah, Israel's enslavement in Egypt, the Exodus, the military conquests in Canaan, even the early days of the monarchy. The house of David may be the one exception, that phrase that was found at the Tel Dan, if indeed it means David. So, we just have so little. Do we have a God-given record of actual events for all of those things listed in blue? Or do we have a history that has been remembered geographically, culturally, politically, and faithfully slanted? These are people of faith. They believe in God, and they believe this to be their real history. It has been passed on traditionally, orally. Or do we have just a human production? That I should probably have said that. With a host of God-centered, purposeful narratives, or maybe just human-centered narratives? It's a question, and scholars struggle with it as well. If actual, if literal, is God as portrayed in those Old Testament or those First Testament passages, especially Genesis, but especially Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy and Joshua? Is God as vicious and militant as that? This statement from Deuteronomy is typical. Do not leave anything that breathes. These were orders that were given, God-given orders supposedly, to Joshua in the conquest. Don't leave anything that breathes. Man, woman, child, that's genocide. Is that your God? Good question. Does God really sanction a father selling his daughter as the Levitical code allows? Does God restrict the eating of pork, really? Does God restrict some seafood? I love seafood. I'm thinking about a trip to New Orleans. Does God require clothing of only one material? I'd be violating it today. Clearly. Why are there two different accounts of the creation and the flood? And as we get into looking at the many of the stories, the accounts from these sources I'm going to talk about, there are slight differences. They're slanted from an Aaronite priest perspective or a Mushite priest perspective. So there are some minor differences there, or that's one explanation at least. Are Adam, Eve, even Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob real people? Or are they simply characters in folklore or some purposeful narrative? And you might ask, purposeful? What is the purpose? Well, here are some possibilities. One, to create or capture and embellish an oral legacy, an oral history, a heritage, and an identity, to create an identity as the people Israel, unique in the world of the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Canaanites and so forth. To express a faith that is unique. It is monotheistic. And the character of God as the source of all creation and sustainer of the universe, stronger and greater and more powerful than any other God on the face of the earth. It's the life giver and guide even in battle. Worthy of worship, praise, tribute, honor. We'd certainly agree with that. Dependable, always. God is always there, not always at the time the people want or need, or they wouldn't have been in exile, or they wouldn't have disappeared in the north. But that's, as some people say, is the fault of the people. Perhaps it was to capture evolving rules for the community, social conduct, how to get along with each other, how to live with a growing population. The more people you have, the more things you have to respect. So maybe these are what a part is captured. And obviously, to answer moral, theological, or historical questions, the Ten Commandments are ethical. They're very moral. That's what that's about, morality. How we have a relationship with God and how we have a relationship with one another, as well as the others. But does the possibility of just a history remembered and human interpolation, in other words, human interjection on top of that, negate the value, the merit, the integrity, the reliability of the Bible? Or is it possible that it gives the Bible more credibility? That God is working in human circumstances just as God is working in our human circumstances today. For me, it is the latter, but I leave each of you to draw your own conclusion. Whether actual or narrative, when were the documents developed? Very little, if any, of the New Testament, First Testament was likely done before the 9th century BCE. The earliest pieces probably date to the Jewish royal courts and during the divided kingdom. Some of it might be 8th century. Most of the Bible has been pulled together during the 6th and 5th century BCE, just pre-exile, exile, and post-exile. Ezra is a scribe post-exile, and Ezra was probably one of those early collators. And from 4 likely sources, the JEDP is a documentary theory first formalized by Julius Wellhausen. He wasn't the first to think of it. He simply built on the research and thoughts of others and refined it. For a long time, this has been accepted as the standard. In recent years, there have been 2 other hypotheses or theories that have evolved. There's the Supplemental Hypothesis, which simply says this is the core, but there are other documents that supported that and came flowing into it. So it isn't just JEDP, 4 different documents. And then there is the Fragmentary Hypothesis, that all of this came together in fragments and was collated. So there are different schools of thought. 4 from likely sources. Again, the first is the J source. J because Wellhausen is a German, and Yahweh would be spelled with a J and pronounced as a Y. So that's the J source. That's probably where it came from the southern kingdom. And the E source, probably done by a Mushite priest. Remember, those are the descendants of Moses. And they were the ones who were completely shut out, ended up at Shiloh. And during the Assyrian campaign, the crisis, they may have made their way south into Jerusalem and began to collate their documents slanted against Aaron and golden calves. And thus the reason for the story to surface. Okay, let me just read you a segment. This is for those of you who want to go into more detail, and this will take you some time to digest because you're going to have to keep referring back and figure out who's who. Who wrote the Bible by Friedman? Let me just read you this section. Recall the priests of Shiloh suffered the loss of their place in the priestly hierarchy under King Solomon. Their chief, Abiathar, was expelled from Jerusalem. The other chief priest, Zadok, who was regarded as descendant of Aaron, remained in power. Northern Levite lands were given to the Phoenicians. The Shiloh prophet Abijah instigated the northern tribes' secession, and he designated Jeroboam as the northern king. The Shiloh priests' hopes for the new kingdom, however, were frustrated when Jeroboam established the golden calf religious centers at Dan and Bethel. And he did not appoint them as priests there. For this old family of priests, what should have been a time of liberation had been turned into a time of religious betrayal. The symbol of their exclusion in Israel was the golden calf, or golden calves, plural, in the temples in the north. The symbol of their exclusion in Judah was Aaron. In the north, it was the golden calves. In the south, it was Aaron. Someone from the family, the author of E, wrote a story that said that soon after the Israelites' liberation from slavery, they committed heresy. Aaron built a golden calf in the wilderness. That's the heresy. They worshiped a golden calf, and who made the golden calf? Aaron. So Aaron is the enemy. Aaron is the problem. Moses is the hero. So this flows into the E document. Again, it's a Mushite priest. Here are some of the other differences. Reuben is named as the son of Jacob who saves Joseph. Remember when Joseph was sold into slavery? That story? There are two different versions. Ephraim and Manasseh get Jacob's birthright. The golden calf story is there. The author probably, for J, came from Judah, and perhaps an Aaronide priest. So Aaron is the hero. Judah is presented as the son of Jacob who saves Joseph, not Reuben. And Judah, the fourth son of Jacob, gets the birthright. This is how scholars know there are different sources, because there are differences in the story and there are differences in the style. God is always Yahweh in the J version. In the E version, it's Elohim, similar to the Canaanite god El. And yet they have some similarities. Abrahamic covenant, and again renewed with David and the Davidic covenant. Okay? Then we get to the P source. The P source is priestly. It has to do with worship. It has to do with things in and around the tabernacle, not the temple. Interesting. Even if it's written, close to the, as scholars believe, in the 6th century, we have the temple. Solomon's temple exists. So why the language from the tabernacle? Maybe it's older than we think, but it seems to be later. We have the largest of the four sources in the P. It's as large as the other three. We're going to talk about D in a moment. I'm running close, guys. Special attention is given to rituals, worship, sacraments. So it's very different from the other two. The other two are mostly historical. It features the Ark of the Tablets, the cherubs, the Urim, and again, this is tabernacle language. Urim and Thummim appear to be objects placed inside the high priest's ephod. Remember the ephod that the priest wore in the tabernacle when Moses was given direction and Aaron given directions on what they were to wear? Moses is respected, but Aaron is the firstborn. They're both Levites, but Aaron gets the emphasis here. Aaron is consecrated as the high priest initially, and we know that. There are no sacrifice stories by Cain, Abel, Noah, Abraham. There's no comment about events outside of the tabernacle. It's all about tabernacle worship. Interesting. Ezekiel seems to quote it. Perhaps Jeremiah, that would be 7th century. That'd be an 8th century BCE prophet. There are no talking animals, so there's no anthropomorphic imagery. God walks, talks, using things that humans do to describe God's behavior and character. Okay? Yahweh is less personal and more cosmic, unforgiving, and his justice is about retribution. You get it wrong, you suffer. The people approach God through the sacrificial altar. That's how they correct what's wrong in their relationship with God. So it was probably written by an Aaronite priest, possibly as late as the exile, but most likely between 722 and 600. Okay, very quickly, let me go to D. D is the law code, probably constructed by Aaronite priests from Shiloh, remember, or maybe Mushites maybe they work together in tandem. These texts possess a strong unity, so it's pretty easy for those literary scholars to be able to read and follow. They emphasize the Davidic covenant, possibly written during the reign of King Josiah, that good king. Possibly written by Jeremiah. Aren't a lot of scholars who sign on to that, but there are a few. Baruch, probably, his scribe, was the one who did it. But he may have put all these laws together. This is where we get the 623 and Leviticus. And here are the theories, plus some of those supplemental. You get Deuteronomy 1, Deuteronomy 2, or the Deuteronomical code. And they all flow into the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, plus other parts of the Tanakh, Joshua, Judges, so forth. Okay? So this is the start of how we get the First Testament. Got some questions? I'm 5 minutes over my time. I did it. And the slides fit, Richard. Who knows? Go figure. I'll keep it at that. God's blessings to you. Have a good week. I'm going to get out of the way of the praise team. Next week we'll talk about pieces of material that evolved during the interbiblical period from Malachi.